Looks the bullies picked the wrong driver. Now they'll never forget this lesson. Marcus Valdez had always been the kind of person who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 24, he possessed an imposing physical presence that he seemed almost apologetic about. 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle wrapped in oversized hoodies and baggy jeans that did little to conceal his powerful frame. His gentle brown eyes and soft-spoken manner made him appear far less intimidating than his genetics had intended. Most people who encountered Marcus saw only his quiet demeanor and assumed he was just another big, harmless guy trying to blend into the background. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent the last 15 years of his life dedicated to mixed martial arts. Starting at age 9, after his immigrant parents enrolled him in classes to build confidence, he had progressed from awkward beginner to regional champion by 18. His basement was lined with trophies, medals, and certificates from competitions across 3 states. But Marcus had learned early that revealing his abilities only brought unwanted attention and challenges from people looking to prove themselves against him. The small industrial town of Millbrook had become Marcus's refuge 6 months ago when he'd taken a job at the local manufacturing plant. He drove the same route every day, down Elm Street, past the community center, through the intersection at 5th and Main, then onto Industrial Boulevard. It was a peaceful 20-minute commute that allowed him to mentally prepare for another day of operating heavy machinery, while his co-workers remained blissfully unaware of his championship background. Unfortunately, peace was something 3 local troublemakers had no interest in preserving. Kyle Brennan, 26, was the unofficial leader of this trio of perpetual adolescents who had never quite figured out how to grow up. Tall and wiry, with sleeve tattoos and a permanent sneer, Kyle drove a modified Camaro that he treated as both transportation and weapon. His constant companions were Jake Morrison, a stocky redhead with anger management issues, and Tommy Greco, whose primary contribution to the group seemed to be laughing at Kyle's increasingly dangerous pranks. These 3 had turned the morning commute into their personal entertainment venue, targeting drivers they deemed vulnerable or interesting. They would tailgate, cut off, and generally terrorize anyone who caught their attention, always backing down when confronted by someone who might actually fight back. They had been watching Marcus for weeks, noting his consistent routine and passive demeanor when they'd tested him with minor provocations. Marcus first noticed them on a Tuesday morning in late September. He was stopped at the red light at 5th and Main when the black Camaro pulled up beside him, music blasting loud enough to rattle windows. Kyle revved his engine repeatedly, trying to get Marcus's attention, but Marcus simply stared straight ahead, waiting for the light to change. When it did, the Camaro shot forward, cutting directly in front of Marcus's modest sedan and forcing him to brake hard. Just ignore them, Marcus told himself, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He had learned long ago that engaging with aggressive drivers rarely ended well for anyone involved. Better to let them have their moment of imagined dominance and continue on with his day. But Kyle and his friends weren't content with a single incident. Over the following weeks, they began to escalate their harassment. They would follow Marcus's car for blocks, honking and shouting obscenities. They threw fast food containers and empty bottles at his windshield when stopped at traffic lights. Jake particularly enjoyed pulling up next to Marcus and making exaggerated gestures, suggesting he was weak or scared. The worst part was how other drivers reacted to these incidents. Most people simply looked away, unwilling to get involved in someone else's confrontation. A few pulled out their phones, but whether to call for help or record potential viral content was unclear. The police seemed perpetually absent during these morning commutes, leaving Marcus to handle the situation on his own. Marcus's co-workers at the plant occasionally asked about the damage to his car, the small dents from thrown objects, the scratched paint where keys had been dragged across his doors in parking lots. He would shrug and claim it was probably just vandalism, unwilling to admit that he was being actively targeted by grown men who had nothing better to do with their time. He could see the pity in their eyes, the assumption that he was simply too passive to stand up for himself. "They have no idea what I'm capable of," Marcus would think during particularly frustrating encounters. But starting a fight won't solve anything. It'll just make things worse. He had worked too hard to build a quiet, stable life to risk it all because of 3 losers who peaked in high school. Marcus had seen what happened when people with his training lost control, the legal consequences, the guilt, the way violence bred more violence. He was determined to be better than that, even if it meant enduring daily humiliation from people who wouldn't last 30 seconds against him in any kind of fair confrontation. The harassment continued into October, becoming more creative and dangerous. Kyle discovered that Marcus always took his lunch break at the same time and began timing his own activities to coincide. He would drive slowly past the plant parking lot, shouting insults about Marcus's appearance, his car, his presumed cowardice. Jake and Tommy would hang out the windows, making obscene gestures and taking photos they claimed they would post online. One particularly memorable incident occurred when Marcus was walking to his car after his shift. Kyle's Camaro pulled up alongside the sidewalk, and all three men got out, surrounding Marcus in a loose semicircle. They were clearly expecting him to cower or run, but Marcus simply stood his ground, hands at his sides, waiting to see what they would do. "Look at this big pussy," Kyle announced loudly enough for other workers to hear. "What are you, like 6'5"? And you just take it like a little bitch every day." Marcus remained silent, his breathing steady and controlled. He could feel the familiar calm that came over him before sparring matches, the way his heart rate actually slowed down. When confronted with potential violence, these men had no idea they were looking at someone who had spent thousands of hours learning how to hurt people efficiently. "I bet he cries himself to sleep every night," Jake added, stepping closer than he should have. "Big baby can't even stand up for himself." Still, Marcus said nothing. He simply stood there, radiating a stillness that should have warned them off if they'd had any real experience with dangerous people. But they interpreted his calm as fear, his silence as weakness. After a few more minutes of increasingly creative insults, they got back in their car and drove away, laughing and congratulating themselves on another successful intimidation. That night, Marcus stood in his basement, working the heavy bag with methodical precision. Each punch landed with the kind of force that would have ended the confrontation in seconds if he'd chosen to use it. But he hadn't, and he was proud of that restraint, even as part of him wondered how long he could maintain it. The breaking point came on a cold Monday morning in early November. Marcus was driving to work, listening to a podcast about conflict resolution, when Kyle's Camaro appeared in his rearview mirror. This time, however, they weren't content with their usual harassment. Kyle pulled up beside Marcus at a red light and began ramming his car into the side of Marcus's sedan. The first impact was light, more of a tap than a true collision. Marcus gripped his steering wheel and continued staring straight ahead, determined not to give them the reaction they wanted. But Kyle wasn't finished. He backed up slightly and hit Marcus's car again, harder this time, leaving a visible dent in the driver's side door. Other drivers at the intersection began honking their horns, some pulling out phones to record the incident. A woman in an SUV was shouting something about calling the police, but the light turned green and traffic began moving before any authorities could arrive. Kyle pulled ahead of Marcus and began brake-checking him repeatedly, forcing Marcus to slow down to avoid rear-ending the Camaro. This went on for several blocks, with Jake and Tommy hanging out the windows, laughing and making gestures at the growing line of frustrated drivers behind them. Then, Kyle made his most dangerous move yet. As they approached a busy intersection, where cross-traffic had the right-of-way, Kyle suddenly swerved in front of Marcus and slammed on his brakes, forcing Marcus to choose between hitting the Camaro or swerving into oncoming traffic. Marcus yanked his steering wheel to the right, sending his sedan sliding across the intersection and narrowly missing a delivery truck. His car jumped the curb and came to rest against a streetlight pole, the front end crumpled and steam rising from the radiator. The impact had been hard enough to deploy his airbags, leaving him momentarily disoriented and tasting blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. As Marcus sat in his damaged car, trying to process what had just happened, he heard car doors slamming. Through his cracked windshield, he could see Kyle, Jake, and Tommy getting out of the Camaro, which had stopped in the middle of the intersection. They were walking toward his car with the swagger of people who believed they had just won some kind of victory. "Look what you did to my car, you fucking moron," Kyle shouted, pointing to a small scratch on his rear bumper. "You're going to pay for that." Marcus slowly pushed his airbag aside and opened his door. As he climbed out of the wreckage, he could feel something fundamental shifting inside him. For months he had absorbed their abuse, convincing himself that taking the high road was worth the daily humiliation. But they had just tried to kill him. They had turned their childish bullying into attempted vehicular homicide, and they were standing there acting like he was the problem. When Marcus straightened to his full height, Kyle took an unconscious step backward. At 6'4" and 230 pounds of pure muscle, Marcus suddenly looked very different from the passive victim they had been tormenting. His oversized hoodie had torn in the crash, revealing the kind of physique that came from years of serious training. His usually gentle eyes had gone cold and focused, the way they did when he was sizing up an opponent in the ring. "You need to get back in your car and leave," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made several bystanders stop what they were doing to listen. Kyle, however, was too invested in his tough guy persona to recognize the warning signs. "Or what, big man? You gonna cry about it? You gonna call the cops like a little—" He never finished the sentence. Marcus had spent 15 years learning how to read body language, and everything about Kyle's posture suggested he was about to escalate to physical violence. So Marcus made the decision that he had been avoiding for months. Kyle's punch was slow, telegraphed, and thrown with the kind of wild haymaker that worked in bar fights against drunk people who couldn't defend themselves. Marcus slipped it easily, stepping inside Kyle's guard and delivering a short, sharp uppercut to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. Jake, apparently not understanding what had just happened to his friend, rushed forward with a wild swing of his own. Marcus caught his wrist, twisted it behind his back, and used Jake's own momentum to drive him face first into the side of the damaged sedan. The impact left a spider web of cracks in the window, and Jake, unconscious on the asphalt. Tommy, showing more intelligence than his companions, started backing toward the Camaro. "Hey man, we were just messing around, we didn't mean anything by it." But Marcus was done listening to their excuses. He had given them months of opportunities to choose a different path, and they had responded by trying to kill him. As Tommy turned to run, Marcus grabbed him by the back of his shirt and spun him around. "You tried to cause a car accident," Marcus said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "You could have killed me. You could have killed innocent people in that intersection." The crowd of bystanders that had gathered was completely silent now, watching as this supposedly passive victim demonstrated exactly why he had been so careful to avoid confrontation. Marcus wasn't hitting these men in anger or revenge, was systematically dismantling them with the kind of technical precision that only came from professional training. Tommy swung wildly, more out of panic than any real attempt to hurt Marcus. Marcus blocked the punch with his forearm, grabbed Tommy by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one hand. For a moment, Tommy's feet kicked uselessly in the air as he clawed at Marcus's grip. "Please," Tommy gasped. "I'm sorry. We're sorry." Marcus set him down but didn't release his grip. "Are you sorry because you got caught? Or are you sorry because you finally understand what you've been doing to me every day for months?" Kyle was struggling to his feet, still wheezing from the body shot. "You're insane," he managed to say. "We were just having fun." "Fun?" Marcus turned to look at him, and Kyle immediately wished he had stayed down. "You call trying to kill me fun? You call months of harassment and intimidation fun?" Several people in the crowd were now filming, with their phones, capturing the moment when the quiet victim finally revealed his true capabilities. Marcus was aware of the cameras, but he was past caring about the potential consequences. These men had crossed a line from which there was no return. "I spent months trying to avoid this," Marcus said, addressing all three of them. "I could have ended this any time I wanted, but I hoped you would get bored and move on to someone else. Instead, you escalated. You made it dangerous." Jake was starting to regain consciousness, blood streaming from his nose where it had connected with the car window. He looked around confused, trying to process how he had gone from standing upright to lying on the ground with a face full of blood. "This is what happens when you pick on someone without knowing who they really are," Marcus announced loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "You assumed I was weak because I chose not to fight back. You assumed I was scared because I tried to avoid confrontation. You were wrong on both counts." A police siren could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Marcus knew that his life was about to become much more complicated, but he felt no regret about his actions. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again, instead of the victim these men had tried to turn him into. "When the police get here," Marcus said, looking at each of the three men in turn, "you're going to tell them exactly what happened. You're going to admit that you caused this accident intentionally. You're going to take responsibility for months of harassment and intimidation." Kyle tried to muster some of his earlier bravado. "No way. We'll tell them you attacked us for no reason." Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Really? With all these witnesses, with all these people filming? Do you think anyone here believes that I attacked you for no reason after what they just saw?" He gestured to the crowd, many of whom were nodding in agreement. A middle-aged woman stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing," she announced. "These idiots tried to cause an accident. They got out of their car to threaten him. He was defending himself." "Same here," added a man in a business suit. "I've been watching them harass this guy for weeks during my commute. It's about time someone stood up to them." The police cars arrived with a screech of brakes and a chorus of slamming doors. 2 officers approached the scene, taking in the damaged cars, the 3 battered men, and Marcus standing calmly in the middle of it all. "What happened here?" the first officer asked. Before Kyle could speak, Marcus stepped forward. "My name is Marcus Valdez. These 3 men have been harassing me for months, and today they tried to cause a car accident that could have killed multiple people. I defended myself when they got out of their car to threaten me." The officer looked at the size difference between Marcus and his attackers, then at the obvious damage to Marcus's car. "And you are?" he asked Kyle. Kyle looked around at the crowd of witnesses, all of whom were staring at him with undisguised contempt. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that his actions had finally caught up with him. "Kyle Brennan," he mumbled. "Well, Mr. Brennan, based on what I'm seeing here and what these witnesses are telling me, you're under arrest for reckless endangerment, vehicular assault, and harassment." As the officers handcuffed Kyle and his friends, Marcus felt a profound sense of relief washing over him. For months he had carried the weight of their daily abuse, telling himself that enduring it was somehow noble. But there was nothing noble about allowing bullies to escalate their behavior until someone got seriously hurt. The aftermath of the confrontation changed everything about Marcus's daily routine. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small town, aided by the multiple phone videos that had captured the fight. But rather than portraying Marcus as a violent aggressor, the footage clearly showed 3 men attacking someone who had been trying to avoid confrontation for months. At work, his co-workers treated him with a new respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with admiration. They had seen him endure months of harassment without complaint, and now they understood why he had been so determined to handle the situation peacefully. Marcus wasn't a passive victim. He was someone strong enough to choose restraint even when he had other options. Kyle, Jake, and Tommy were charged with multiple crimes related to their months of harassment. The district attorney was particularly interested in the attempted vehicular assault, which carried serious felony charges. Security camera footage from various businesses along Marcus's route provided evidence of their pattern of harassment, turning what might have been dismissed as a simple road rage incident into a clear case of stalking and intimidation. During the court proceedings, Marcus testified about the daily harassment he had endured and his efforts to avoid escalation. When asked why he hadn't fought back sooner, his answer was simple. "I hoped they would realize they were heading down a dangerous path and choose to stop. I gave them every opportunity to walk away." The judge was impressed by Marcus's restraint and his clear attempt to de-escalate the situation over many months. Kyle received 2 years in prison, while Jake and Tommy were sentenced to 1 year each, along with extensive community service and mandatory anger management counseling. 6 months later, Marcus still drove the same route to work, but the experience was completely different. The intersection where the confrontation had occurred now featured a small memorial plaque thanking him for his courage, installed by local business owners who had witnessed the incident. Other drivers would occasionally recognize him and offer a thumbs up or a friendly wave. The most significant change was in Marcus himself. He no longer felt the need to hide his capabilities or apologize for his size. He still preferred peaceful solutions to conflict, but he had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself was the only way to prevent a situation from becoming truly dangerous. On a warm spring morning, as Marcus drove to work listening to the same podcast about conflict resolution, he reflected on everything that had happened. He had spent months believing that enduring abuse was somehow more noble than fighting back, but that thinking had nearly gotten him killed.